There is a kind of knowledge that cannot be argued into a person. It has to arrive the way cold arrives, through the walls, under the door, into the bones, until the person in question has no choice but to acknowledge it. I spent the better part of 3 years arguing against Clara Voss's ideas. I spent 6 weeks in her house learning why I had been wrong. And I have spent the 40 years since trying to make sure I was the last man in Plover Creek County who had to nearly lose his wife to cold before he was willing to listen to a woman who already knew the answer. My name is Harold Finch. I am 71 years old, and I have been a carpenter since I was 14, which means I have spent 57 years thinking carefully about how structures are built and why they hold or fail. I tell you this not to establish my credentials, but to explain the particular quality of my error. I was not an ignorant man who dismissed Clara out of ignorance. I was a knowledgeable man who dismissed her out of certainty. And certainty, I have come to understand, is the more dangerous condition of the two because it feels exactly like wisdom from the inside. My nephew is sitting across from me in this workshop right now, waiting for me to get to the point. He is young and from Ohio, and he has asked me a simple question about those 3 structures he can see from the window, the ones that sit in the hillsides east of town like animals settled into the earth, half hidden now by 40 years of grass and time. He wants to know why they are built into the hill rather than on the flat ground where a proper house belongs. It is not a short answer, but it is a true one. And it begins, as most true things do, with a problem that everyone could see and almost nobody was willing to think about carefully. The problem was winter, not winter as an inconvenience, not winter as a season to be endured with adequate preparation and a good coat. Winter on the Nebraska prairie in those years was a specific and patient adversary that operated according to principles most of us had not taken the time to understand. We had come from Ohio and Indiana and Pennsylvania and Virginia, and we had brought with us the knowledge of how to build houses in those places, frame construction, milled lumber, a central stove, a brick chimney. And we had set those houses down on the open flatland of the Platte River Valley as if the land itself had no opinion about the matter. The land had opinions. The Nebraska prairie offers a man building a house almost nothing to work with and almost nothing to hide behind. There are no hills of consequence within 10 miles of Plover Creek. There is no significant timber within 20. The ground is rich, black topsoil over clay, over limestone, but it lies flat and open in every direction, and the wind that crosses it in January does not slow down for anything a human hand has built. It comes out of the northwest at 30, 40, 50 miles an hour, carrying snow it has picked up from Saskatchewan, and it finds every seam, every gap, every place where 2 boards were supposed to meet flush but settled a 1/4 inch apart over the summer. It packs into those gaps. It drives through window frames. It makes a conventional frame house feel, on the worst nights, less like a shelter than like a thin argument against the weather. To heat such a house in a serious Nebraska winter required wood, a great deal of wood, and wood on the open prairie required money because there was almost none growing within practical distance. You bought it from the lumber yard at prices that Hal Decker set and that reflected the cost of hauling it by rail and then by wagon from the timbered country to the north. A cord of good hardwood in 1877 cost a man in Plover Creek more than 2 days' wages. A frame house of average size in an average Nebraska winter consumed 8 to 10 cords between November and April. Do that arithmetic. Most of the families in Plover Creek were doing it constantly, the way a man does arithmetic when the numbers keep coming up short. This was the problem. It was visible to everyone. It was discussed at the general store and at the feed mill and on Sunday mornings after services. People talked about it the way people talk about problems that seem too large and too fixed to be solved, with a kind of resigned fluency, the vocabulary of complaint rather than inquiry. The winters are hard. The wood is dear. What can you do? Clara Voss was, as far as I know, the only person in Plover Creek County in the winter of 1876 who was asking that question in earnest. I should tell you about Elias first because Clara's story does not begin with Clara. It begins with a man who was good and willing and entirely typical in his approach to the problem of winter, and who died before he understood that typical was not going to be sufficient. Elias Voss came to Nebraska from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, in the spring of 1874. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, with the particular optimism of a man who has worked hard all his life and believes, not unreasonably, that hard work is the answer to most questions. He filed his homestead claim on 80 acres of flat bottomland 2 miles north of Plover Creek, and he spent his first summer building a house. It was a good house by the standards of the time. 16 by 24 feet, milled lumber from Decker's yard, a stone foundation he laid himself, glass windows ordered from a catalog out of Omaha. He was proud of it. He had reason to be. He also built it exactly the way every other house in the county was built. 4 vertical walls on flat ground, broad northern face unprotected, a single wood-burning stove at the center, 1 chimney of salvaged brick that drew reasonably well in calm weather and poorly in wind. Clara Voss came to Nebraska as Elias's wife, having married him the previous autumn in Lancaster. She was 28 years old. Her father had been a textile manufacturer, a precise man who had built his business on an understanding of how fiber behaved, how it held or released warmth, how the structure of a woven thing determined what it could and could not do against the cold. Clara had grown up in a workshop full of that knowledge. She had not known, until she arrived in Nebraska, that it was unusual knowledge to have. She knew, for instance, that the reason a wool blanket is warm is not the wool itself, but the air trapped within the fiber's crimp. 10,000 tiny pockets of stillness, each one resisting the movement of heat from the warm body beneath to the cold air above. She knew that moving air conducts warmth away from a surface at a rate that still air does not. She knew that the thickness of a material matters less than its structure, and that a thin layer of the right thing will outperform a thick layer of the wrong thing every time. She had simply never had occasion in Lancaster County to apply this knowledge to a building. Elias died of typhoid fever in August of 1876. He was 33 years old. The illness came on in a dry summer, moved quickly, and left Clara a widow in the space of 11 days. The owner of 80 acres, 1 mare named Soot, 12 laying hens, 1 milk cow, and a house that she spent the following winter learning in the most expensive possible way was not adequate to the situation. She burned through a full cord of wood by the end of November. She woke each morning to frost on the inside surface of the north wall. The water bucket beside the stove, 3 feet from an active fire, developed a skim of ice by 4 in the morning. She spent 2 hours of every short winter day simply maintaining the fire at a level that kept the house above freezing, which left her 6 hours of useful daylight for every other task a woman alone on 80 acres in winter needs to accomplish. She was not frightened by this. Clara was not a woman who frightened easily. But she was a woman who thought carefully, and what she thought through that first winter was this: the house is wrong. Not the stove, not the wood supply. The house itself is wrong in its principles, and no amount of additional firewood will correct a wrong principle. By February, she had begun keeping a ledger. The ledger is the thing I want you to understand about Clara, because it is the thing that separated her from every other person in Plover Creek who understood the problem. Everyone felt the cold. Everyone complained about the wood bills. Clara wrote things down. She recorded the temperature inside the house at 4 points each day: dawn, mid-morning, mid-afternoon, and before sleep. She recorded how much wood she burned and when. She recorded the outside temperature when she could measure it and estimated it when she could not. She recorded the condition of her root vegetables in the cellar, which were rotting by January, the cellar being too warm and too damp, dug in the wrong soil at the wrong depth. She recorded the direction and approximate speed of the wind each morning. By the end of that first winter, she had 90 pages of observations and a set of conclusions that she had not shared with anyone because no one had asked. That spring, she went to see the old Lakota woman who lived at the edge of town. I will tell you about White Corn Woman in detail later because she deserves the full account. For now, I will tell you only the essential thing. She lived in a structure that was half dug into the earth, framed with salvaged lumber on the south face with a roof of compacted clay and rivergrass. And when you walked into it from a February morning, the warmth that met you was not the sharp warmth of a fire recently stoked. It was the deep, settled, permanent warmth of a place that had not been cold in a very long time. A different kind of warmth. The warmth of something that was designed to be warm rather than continuously forced to be warm. Clara went to ask about her rotting vegetables. She stayed for 3 hours. She came back 4 days later. She kept coming back until she understood not just what White Corn Woman had built, but why. The physical logic underneath it, the principles of earth and fiber, and still air and below-grade temperature that made the structure work without demanding anything from a stove that it did not strictly need. The following spring, she tore down Elias's house. I heard about this second-hand, which is to say, I heard it the way news travels in a town of 300 people, quickly, imprecisely, and with a quality of alarm that the facts themselves did not quite justify. What I heard was that the Voss widow had lost her mind to grief and was pulling up her floorboards. What was actually happening was considerably more deliberate than that, but deliberateness does not travel as fast as alarm, and by the time anyone understood what Clara was actually doing, the opinion of the town had already formed around the simpler story. She was tearing down a perfectly good house. She was going to live in a hole in the ground. She was a woman alone, without the guidance of a husband or a father or any sensible relation, making a catastrophic decision that would leave her without shelter before the next winter came. Reverend Cole rode out on a Tuesday afternoon in May with what I can only describe as the expression of a man performing an act of pastoral necessity that he would personally prefer to avoid. He found Clara in the middle of what had been her kitchen, systematically pulling boards from the wall framing with a pry bar, working with the even rhythm of someone doing a job they have planned carefully and intend to complete. He asked if she was well. She said she was very well. He asked if she understood what she was doing. She said she understood it precisely. He asked whether she might consider accepting the town's assistance in repairing the existing structure rather than, he paused here, choosing his word, dismantling it. Clara set down the pry bar. She looked at Reverend Cole with an expression I was not present to see, but that Jonas described to me years later as the look of a person who has prepared for a conversation and has decided to be patient with it. She said, I appreciate your concern, Reverend. The existing structure cannot be repaired into adequacy. I am building something that will work. I would be glad to explain it if you would like to understand it. Cole did not want to understand it. He wanted her to stop or at least to accept the comfort of being worried over. He left after a few more minutes, having accomplished neither, and the following Sunday his sermon touched, with some care, on the importance of community guidance in times of grief and the particular dangers of solitary decision-making. Everyone in the congregation understood who he was preaching about. Clara was not in the congregation. She was, in all probability, working. The first time Clara Voss walked into White Corn Woman's house, she was carrying a basket of soft carrots and a specific question. The carrots were from her root cellar, a dugout she had extended from the back of Elias's house the previous autumn, following the general understanding of how root cellars were made. Dig down 4 feet, line the walls with boards if you have them, store your vegetables there through the winter and they would keep. That was what everyone did. That was what everyone knew. Clara had done it correctly, and her carrots had gone soft by January, and her beets had developed a gray bloom that spread from the root end inward, and she had spent 6 weeks eating from compromised stores and keeping careful notes about it. The question was, why? It was not a question she could ask at the general store, where Hollis Dreyer would have smiled sympathetically and suggested she had not dug down far enough. It was not a question she could ask Dorothy Marsh or any member of the Ladies' Improvement Society who understood food preservation in terms of pickling and salting and smoking, but not in terms of the physical principles that made one cellar work and another fail. It was, as it happened, a question that had a precise and knowable answer, an answer rooted in soil composition, depth, drainage, and the relationship between moisture and temperature. And the only person within 20 miles of Plover Creek who held that answer, as far as Clara could determine, was the old Lakota woman who lived in the low-framed structure at the town's northern edge, whom most people walked past without looking at, and whom Clara had been watching with interest since the previous October. She had watched the smoke from White Corn Woman's chimney. More precisely, she had watched how little of it there was. White Corn Woman's given name, her full name, in her own language, Clara never learned to pronounce correctly, though she tried. The town called her nothing at all, which is its own kind of naming. She was perhaps 65 years old in the spring of 1877, though she might have been older. Her face held the particular stillness of a person who has long since stopped expending energy on the opinions of people who have not earned the right to hold them. She was not unkind. She was simply economical, with words, with fire, with the considerable intelligence she applied to the problem of living well in a place that did not make living easy. She opened the door when Clara knocked and looked at the basket of soft carrots, and then at Clara herself, and whatever she saw in Clara's face must have satisfied some internal criterion, because she stepped back from the doorway and said, "Come in, then." What Clara felt when she crossed that threshold was the thing she would describe to Jonas years later as the beginning of her real education. Not warmth in the dramatic sense, not the aggressive heat of a freshly stoked fire that hits you like a wave and fades when the wood burns down. What she felt was steadiness. The temperature inside that small structure was perhaps 58 degrees, cool by the standards of a well-heated room, but absolutely, unnervingly constant. There was no cold wall on the north side. There was no warm pocket near the stove fading to a chill pocket near the door. The air in every corner of that room was the same. The structure was not fighting the cold outside. It was simply not participating in it. Clara stood in the center of the room for a moment, and the part of her mind that her father had trained in the physics of fiber and warmth began quietly to work. White Corn Woman put a kettle on. They talked for 3 hours that first afternoon. Clara asked about the carrots first, the specific question she had come with, and White Corn Woman answered it with the directness of a person who respects a practical question. The problem was the soil composition. The clay-heavy ground beneath Elias's cellar held moisture rather than draining it. And in that moisture-laden cold, the vegetables were not merely chilled, but slowly desiccated and then rotted by the very humidity meant to preserve them. The solution was either different soil, a sandier vein, higher and drier, or a sealed floor and walls that kept the storage chamber's atmosphere controlled. White Corn Woman showed her the back of her own small cellar. Floor stones set close and smooth, walls of densely packed clay that had been burnished flat with a smooth river stone until they were nearly impermeable. Dry as a book. 48 degrees in February, she said. Never colder, never warmer. Clara wrote this in her ledger that evening. Dry, still, constant. But the carrots were not the question that stayed with Clara. The question that stayed was the one she asked before she left, standing near the door, looking again at the walls of the structure. At the framing she could see where the interior plaster had chipped near the window. 2 layers of board with a gap between them, packed with something pale and fibrous that she could not immediately identify. "What is in the walls?" she asked. White Corn Woman pulled a handful of dried material from a bundle hanging near the ceiling and held it out. Clara took it. It was cattail fluff, the seed head of the broadleaf cattail that grew in the sloughs and drainage ditches along the Platte River, dried and compressed and packed until it was dense enough to hold its shape, but still full of the innumerable small air pockets that gave it its character. "The field mouse uses this," White Corn Woman said. "It lines its winter nest. You know what a field mouse's nest feels like inside in January?" Clara said she did not. Warm, White Corn Woman said simply, "Completely warm. The mouse does not build a bigger nest. It builds a smarter one." Clara turned the cattail fiber in her fingers. Her father had spent 30 years working with wool, and wool's warmth, as she had understood since childhood, came not from the fiber itself, but from the air the fiber trapped. A wool blanket is not warm because wool is warm. It is warm because the crimp of the individual fiber creates a structure of 10,000 tiny chambers, each holding a pocket of still air. And still air is a profoundly poor conductor of heat. It resists the movement of warmth from one side of the material to the other with a stubbornness that no solid material, however thick, can match. The cattail fiber worked on the same principle. Packed between two walls, it created a structure that was not solid but cellular. Not a barrier against cold, but a maze through which cold could make almost no progress. Clara held the fiber and understood, with the particular clarity of a person recognizing something they have always known in a new context, exactly what kind of house she needed to build. She did not rush. This is the part of the story that people who did not know Clara tend to find difficult to believe, because in the telling it sounds as though she had a revelation and then immediately acted on it. What she actually did was spend the rest of the spring thinking, and then most of the early summer planning, and then August staking. The thinking happened in the ledger, 40 pages of it over 3 months. She went back to White Corn Woman 7 more times, not always with questions, sometimes simply to spend an afternoon in a structure that was working correctly while she observed how it worked. She noted that the south-facing window, though small, admitted a column of low winter sunlight for several hours each clear day. She noted that the earth floor at the back of the structure, below grade by nearly 3 feet, maintained a temperature close to 50 degrees, regardless of what the weather outside was doing. She asked White Corn Woman about this and received an answer she wrote down verbatim in the ledger. "The earth is a slow thing. It takes the summer's heat all season to absorb it, and it gives it back all winter the same way. Below the frost line, it does not know what month it is." Clara underlined this sentence. Below the frost line, it does not know what month it is. She drew the first rough plan on the back of a feed receipt in June. A rectangular structure, partially excavated into the south-facing face of the low bluff a quarter-mile from Elias's property. The excavation would put her floor 3 feet below grade on 3 sides, earth walls on the north, east, and west, with the insulating mass of the hillside itself between her and the prevailing northwest wind. The south face alone would be exposed, framed in the conventional way, with a small window oriented to admit the low winter sun. The roof would not be pitched timber and shingle. It would be a post and beam frame, heavily timbered to handle the load she was planning to put on it, covered with a continuous membrane of salvaged canvas, sealed with pine pitch, and then 18 inches of compacted earth, and then grass planted into that earth. In spring, her roof would look like the ground around it. She sat with this plan for 3 weeks, looking for its failures. The roof load was the first problem she identified. 18 inches of compacted earth over a 20 by 28 foot structure represented approximately 50,000 pounds of dead weight pressing down on the frame. She needed timber sized for that load, not the standard 6 by 6 posts Decker sold for house framing, but the heaviest salvaged lumber she could get, mortised and tenoned at every joint. She priced this out. It was the largest single-line item in her budget, which she calculated to within the dollar across 4 pages of arithmetic. The second problem was moisture. An earthen structure that was not properly drained was not a warm house. It was a cold, damp one, which was worse than a cold, dry one. She solved this by designing a continuous French drain around the perimeter, a channel of river gravel deep enough to intercept any water moving through the hillside, directing it away from the structure before it could enter the floor or walls. The third problem was ventilation. A well-insulated structure with animals and people inside it and no air exchange became, in Clara's calculations, a problem of a different kind. She designed 2 small vents, one high in the south wall, one low, that could be opened or closed depending on conditions, creating a controlled exchange of air without surrendering significant heat. On the 22nd of August, 1877, she drove 4 stakes into the south face of the bluff and began digging. Jonas Hewitt appeared on the 3rd morning. He was 14 years old that summer, thin, in the way of boys whose families ate adequately, but not generously, with the watchful, self-contained quality that circumstances had developed in him early. He had no particular reason to be on the bluff north of town on a Tuesday morning, except that he had seen Clara working from the road the previous 2 days and had come closer each time, drawn by the combination of curiosity and the specific interest a boy with a good mechanical mind takes in any operation he does not immediately understand. He stood at a polite distance and watched her work. Clara dug for 20 minutes without acknowledging him. Then she handed him the second shovel. $2 a week, she said, plus dinner. He took the shovel. He did not ask what they were building. He had learned in 14 years that it was better to watch and understand than to ask and be given an answer you could not yet evaluate. He began digging. 3 days later, he asked his first question. He had been watching Clara lay the first course of her double wall, an outer layer of adobe brick she had cast herself in a wooden form, set with a careful 3-inch gap from the inner course of salvaged board. And he understood the brickwork, and he understood the boarding, but he could not understand the gap. "Why are you leaving that space?" he asked. "Won't it weaken the wall?" Clara stopped and considered how to answer this in a way that would be genuinely useful rather than merely correct. She reached into the burlap sack beside her and took out a handful of dried cattail fiber. She held it up. "This goes in the gap," she said. "Every 3 inches of it you pack in there is a wall inside the wall, not made of anything solid but made of air, still air, air that cannot move." She pressed the fiber between her palms and let him feel the resistance of it, dense but yielding, full of the small chambers that were its whole purpose. Moving air carries heat away from a warm surface and brings cold to take its place. That is how every cold night in every badly built house in this county works. But still air, air trapped in pockets too small to circulate, does almost nothing. It sits there between the warmth inside and the cold outside, and it refuses to carry the message. Jonas turned this over in his mind. Then he took the cattail fiber and examined it with the close attention he gave to everything he was trying to understand. "Like the inside of a bird's feather," he said. Clara looked at him. "Exactly like that," she said. "Yes." He went home that evening and wrote it in the margin of his school primer with a stub of pencil, in the small, careful hand of a boy who had learned that certain things are worth writing down. Still air does not move heat. Fiber makes the air still. He did not yet know what he would do with this knowledge, but he did not lose it. In 40 years of building across 3 counties of Nebraska, he would reach back to that margin note more times than he could count. Reaching back past his apprenticeship with me, past the years of journeyman work, past the reputation that eventually preceded him, all the way back to a Tuesday morning on a bluff north of Plover Creek, and a woman explaining the inside of a feather with a handful of cattail and a 3-inch gap between 2 courses of wall. It was the best lesson either of us ever got. A structure teaches you things during its construction that it will not teach you any other way. I have been building in wood for 57 years, and I can tell you that the difference between a plan and a building is the same as the difference between a map and a territory. The map does not include the rain that falls on the 3rd week of August, or the vein of soft clay that appears 4 feet down where the survey said there would be hard pan, or the particular way a green timber will check and split along its length when it dries faster on one face than the other. The plan is a statement of intention. The building is an argument with reality, conducted one problem at a time, and the quality of the builder is measured not in the elegance of the plan, but in the quality of the solutions they find when the plan meets the ground. Clara Voss was, in this sense, one of the finest builders I have ever known. And I say this as a man who spent the first 2 years of her construction telling anyone who would listen that she did not know what she was doing. I was wrong about the conclusion. I was not entirely wrong about the difficulties. There were many of them. The adobe wall failed in the 4th week of August. Clara had been casting her bricks in a wooden form of her own design, a 2-chamber mold that produced bricks 14 inches long and 4 inches deep, mixed from the heavy clay subsoil of the bluff with river grass cut and dried and chopped to short lengths, which acted as a binding fiber in the same way that straw binds conventional adobe. She had tested her mix ratio across 6 sample bricks before beginning the wall proper, and the samples had cured cleanly in the summer heat. The wall itself, laid in 3 courses over 10 days, had appeared equally sound. On the night of August 29th, a thunderstorm came through from the southwest. Not a severe storm, an inch of rain in 2 hours, the kind of summer weather that the prairie produces without particular malice or intent. Clara was in Elias's dismantled house, which she was still sleeping in while the new structure took shape. When she went out the following morning, the outer course of the north section of her double wall had collapsed along a 6-foot run, the bricks having absorbed the rain and returned to something close to the mud they had been made from. Jonas found her standing in front of the collapse when he arrived. She was not distressed. She was studying it. She had her ledger open, and she was writing in it with the calm concentration of a person conducting an investigation rather than suffering a loss. And what she was writing was an analysis of why that particular section had failed when the others had not. The answer, which she had arrived at by the time Jonas came close enough to read over her shoulder, was drainage. The north section of the wall sat in a shallow depression in the bluff face where water naturally collected. The other section sat on slightly elevated ground that had shed the rain before it could saturate. The bricks themselves were adequate. The site preparation was not. "We'll need to cut a channel," she said, without looking up from the ledger, "along the full perimeter, 8 inches deep, filled with river gravel, before we lay another brick." Jonas looked at the collapsed wall and then at the ledger and then at Clara. "That's 3 days of work," he said. 2.5, she said. "If we start now." They started now. They cut the perimeter channel by hand. Clara with the mattock, Jonas with the spade, following the line she staked out that morning, and they filled it with river gravel hauled in the wheelbarrow from the creek bed a 1/4 mile away. 18 loads over 2 days. Then they rebuilt the failed section, this time setting the base course on a bed of that same gravel so that any water reaching the wall's foundation would pass through and away rather than pooling against it. The rebuilt section cured in 4 days and did not move again. I did not know about this at the time. Jonas told me years later, in the matter-of-fact way he told most stories about Clara's construction, not as tales of hardship overcome, but as technical case studies, problems correctly diagnosed and methodically solved. He said what he remembered most was not the collapsed wall, but Clara's face while she was writing in the ledger. She didn't look like someone whose wall had just fallen down, he told me. She looked like someone who had just learned something useful. The roof frame went up in the 2nd week of September, and this was the part of the construction that I did see, because I drove out on a Sunday afternoon with Thomas Brower, the feed mill operator, who had heard about the timber sizing and wanted a look. What I saw stopped me at the fence line for a full 10 minutes before I walked closer. Clara had salvaged the heaviest timbers from Elias's house, the corner posts, which Elias had cut from green cottonwood and which had cured in place over 3 years to a hardness close to iron, and she had supplemented them with 4 additional posts she had bought from Decker, the heaviest section he stocked, 8 by 8 inches. These were her roof supports, set in pairs 12 feet apart, mortised at the top to receive the main carrying beams. The beams themselves were doubled, 2 members spiked together to act as one, a technique I had seen used in mill construction, but never in a residential building. The secondary framing across the beams was set at 16-inch intervals, closer than any roof framing I had built or seen built. I looked at this for a long time. I looked at the depth of the mortise cuts, which were precise. I looked at the way the doubled beams were spiked, not randomly, but at calculated intervals, so that the 2 members shared the load evenly along their full length. I looked at the post spacing, and I did, in my head, the rough calculation that told me the timber sizing was correct for the load it was going to carry. I did not tell Clara this. What I told Brower on the drive back to town was that the framing was heavier than necessary and probably the result of an excess of caution. Brower agreed with me. We were both wrong, and the framing was not the result of caution. It was the result of arithmetic done on the back of a feed receipt and checked twice by a woman who had calculated the load to within 5% and then added a margin she could justify on paper. The canvas membrane went on over 3 days, stretched tight, and sealed at every seam with pine pitch. Then the first layer of compacted earth, 6 inches, tamped by hand with a flat-bottomed post until it rang like something almost solid, then another 6 inches, then the final 6, into which Clara pressed a mixture of native grass seed and the roots of buffalo grass she had cut from the bluff face specifically for this purpose, choosing a grass whose root system was deep and horizontal and would bind the roof surface into something close to sod within a single growing season. Jonas stood on the finished roof on the last day of September and jumped twice, lightly testing it. It did not flex. It did not shift. It felt, he told me later, like standing on the ground. "It is the ground," Clara told him from below. "That's the whole point." She moved in on the 7th of October, which was earlier than she had planned, because the nights had begun to carry a quality she did not like. I want to describe this carefully because it is easy to make it sound like intuition or premonition, and it was neither of those things. What Clara had was observation, systematically maintained over 2 full years in the same landscape, which is something closer to a scientific instrument than to a feeling. She had her ledger. She had 90 pages of recorded temperatures, wind directions, precipitation events, and biological observations. The migration timing of birds, the behavior of the cattle she could see from her property line, the growth patterns of the vegetation along the creek. She had a baseline. And in September and October of 1879, what she was seeing did not match her baseline. The migration was early, not slightly early. The meadowlarks had gone by the 2nd week of September, which was 22 days ahead of the earliest departure she had recorded in 2 previous years. The Canada geese came through in one long continuous movement rather than the usual scattered groups over several weeks, as if something behind them was moving faster than they preferred. The wild plum along the creek had produced an extraordinary crop, dense and heavy, the kind of growth that Clara had read about in a farming almanac, as a traditional indicator of a hard winter ahead, noted there with the cautious skepticism of a publication that did not want to be held responsible for folk wisdom, but felt obliged to record it. She also checked the barometric pressure each morning with the small brass barometer she had bought in Omaha during the summer. In October of 1879, it was doing things she had not seen it do before. On the 14th of October, she wrote in her ledger, "All indicators this winter will be severe. Prepare as if for the worst season in memory, because I believe that is what it will be." Then she turned to the practical consequences of this entry. She bought 3 times her usual supply of dried beans and cornmeal from Hollis Dryer's store, carrying it in the wagon herself because she did not want to explain the quantity to anyone who might ask. She bought an additional 50 pounds of salt pork and 6 gallons of lamp oil. She cut twice her usual harvest of cattail, not for insulation, which was already complete, but for use as supplemental fuel, dried cattail stalks burning long and even in a small stove. She checked every seal in the south wall and re-leveled the door frame, which had settled a quarter-inch over the summer. And then, in the first week of November, she moved her animals inside. The integration of the stable into the main structure was the part of Clara's design that people found strangest. Stranger, even, than the earthen roof or the double wall, because it violated a principle so fundamental to conventional building that most people had never thought to examine it. Animals belonged outside. A house was for people. The line between the two was one of the clearest lines in a prairie town's understanding of how civilized life was organized. Clara's line was in a different place. She had designed the stable as an extension of the main structure from the beginning, a space carved into the hillside to the east of the living quarters, sharing the north, east, and back walls of the hill itself, separated from the living space by a single interior partition of close-fitted boards with two small adjustable vents cut near the floor. It held her cow, her mare Soot, and the two goats she had acquired the previous spring, 4 animals. 4 bodies, each producing heat continuously, through the night, through the coldest hours, without requiring wood or attention or anything beyond the fodder she would have fed them regardless. Jonas asked her about this in early November, when she set him to hauling extra hay into the cave-like interior of the stable, enough to last through January without a resupply. He asked how much heat 4 animals actually produced. Clara consulted something she had written in the ledger the previous winter, a calculation she had made after reading a pamphlet on animal husbandry from the State Agricultural Office, which had included, almost as an aside, the information that a mature dairy cow maintained a body temperature of 101 degrees and radiated heat continuously as a consequence of this. She had done the rough calculation herself, comparing the BTU output of animal bodies against her stove's rated capacity. On a cold night, she said, those 4 animals together produce more heat than my stove does in 2 hours of burning, and they produce it all night, every night, without costing me a stick of wood. Jonas looked at the animals, then at the vents in the partition, then at Clara. Why doesn't everyone do this, he asked. Clara thought about this for a moment. Because it requires thinking about the house as a system, she said. Most people think about the house as a box. They put a fire in the box to make it warm. When the fire goes out, the box gets cold, and they put another fire in. The wood bill is the cost of thinking about it that way. She looked at the vents, at the thin slot of warm air moving through them from the stable side, already measurable on the back of the hand, even in the mild November afternoon. I am trying to think about it differently. On the 21st of November, White Corn Woman did not answer her door. Clara found her in the morning, in the chair beside the small stove, with her hands folded in her lap, and her face holding the specific peace of a person who had known for some time that a thing was coming and had made whatever arrangements seemed necessary. She was not suffering. She had not suffered, as far as Clara could determine. She had simply, in the night, reached the end of what a body can sustain, and had reached it in a house that was 58 degrees and dry and quiet. Clara sat with her for a long time before she went to find the Reverend. The burial was 4 days later, in the frozen ground of the county cemetery at the edge of town. Clara was the only person from the town proper who came. There was a Lakota family, 3 people Clara did not know, who had traveled 2 days from the north, and they stood on the other side of the grave and performed their own observance in their own language, and Clara stood on her side and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would be adequate, and the wind came across the flat ground from the northwest and did not stop for anyone. She drove home in the wagon in the late afternoon, with the sky behind her going the color of an old bruise along the western horizon. She unhitched Soot and led her into the stable and checked the other animals, and went in it and lit the lamp and opened the ledger. She sat for a while without writing anything. Then she wrote, November 21st, WCW, gone. Everything she knew, I carry now. Do not waste it. She closed the ledger. She stoked the stove once, briefly, and then let it settle. The temperature in the room without the stove, without any fire at all, held at 56 degrees. Outside, the thermometer on the south wall read 19. She had built correctly. She knew this. The knowledge did not comfort her the way she had expected it to. 3 weeks later, on the 12th of December, she woke at 4 in the morning to a sound she had not heard before. A low, continuous vibration in the north wall of the bluff, transmitted through 18 inches of compacted earth, as if the hillside itself were resonating with something large and distant that was moving toward it. She lay still and listened to it for a long time. Then she got up, dressed, and went to the ledger. The hard winter did not announce itself with a single storm. That is the detail that gets lost in the telling when people tell it at all. They want a dramatic event, one catastrophic night, one wall of white arriving from the northwest, one moment of before and after. What actually happened was slower and more thorough, and in many ways more terrible, because a single storm can be survived on stubbornness and adrenaline, but 4 months of relentless, grinding cold requires something different. It requires a structure that does not need you to fight for it. It requires a system that simply works while you attend to other things. The first hard freeze came on the 14th of December. The temperature dropped to -18 overnight and did not recover above zero for 11 days. Then it rose briefly, 4 days in the low 20s, enough for the town to exhale. And then it dropped again, harder this time to -26, and this time it stayed. January of 1880 was the coldest month in the recorded history of the Platte River Valley. The river itself froze to the bottom in the shallows. The cottonwood trees along the creek split audibly in the night, the sap freezing and expanding until the wood gave way with a sound like a rifle shot that carried for half a mile in the still, cold air. The snow did not fall heavily. It was too cold for heavy snow. But what fell was fine and dry, and the wind moved it continuously, building drifts against the north faces of every structure in Plover Creek with a patience and a weight that the structures had not been designed to resist. I burned through my remaining hardwood by the 18th of January. I burned my fence rails by the 24th. I burned my workbench on the 28th, which was a thing I had built with my own hands from good white oak 20 years earlier, and which I fed into the stove piece by piece over the course of a single night, while my wife Margaret lay in the bed closest to it with a cough that had begun 10 days earlier as a mild irritation, and had become, by then, something I could not afford to think about directly. By the 1st of February, Margaret's fever had been running for 4 days. I want to be precise about what I decided, and why, and when, because imprecision would make it a better story and a less honest one. I did not decide to go to Clara's house because I had experienced some transformation of understanding. I had not. I still believed, at some level I was not examining carefully, that her methods were eccentric, and that the coming spring would reveal some structural problem that would vindicate my professional judgment. What I decided was that the temperature in my house was no longer compatible with my wife recovering from what she had, and that the two remaining options were to find her a warmer place or to watch her get worse in a cold one. I knew where the warm place was. I dressed in everything I owned that could function as clothing. I went to Margaret and told her we were going to Clara Voss's house, and she looked at me with the expression of a woman who has been married long enough to know when her husband is finally doing something he should have done earlier, and she said, "All right, Harold." The walk was 1.5 miles. In that cold, 1.5 miles is not a short distance. The wind was from the northwest at perhaps 25 miles an hour, which put the effective temperature somewhere that the thermometer was not designed to measure. I kept Margaret on my left side, between me and whatever partial shelter the fence line offered. We did not speak. Conversation was not practical in that wind, and there was nothing to say that would have helped either of us. What I remember most about that walk is a specific moment about 2/3 of the way through it, when I looked ahead and saw the low profile of Clara's structure against the hillside, the earthen mound, the small south-facing window with its square of lamplight, the way the whole thing sat in the landscape with the settled patience of something that had grown there rather than been placed there. I had looked at that structure for 2.5 years and seen each time an object of mild ridicule. What I saw now was a lamp in a window. I saw it with the specific quality of vision that extreme cold and genuine fear produce in a person. The quality that strips everything down to what matters and leaves the rest behind. I knocked. Clara opened the door. The warmth that came through the opening was the same warmth I remembered from my one previous visit. Not aggressive, not dramatic, simply there, steady and total and deep. The warmth of a space that had not been seriously cold since the first frost in October. She looked at Margaret first, then at me. I said, "She has a fever. The house has gone cold." Clara stepped back from the door. She said, "Come in." And then, before I could move, "No, wait." She took her coat from the hook beside the door, put it on, and came outside past us both. She looked at the sky for a moment, the flat, gray, textureless sky of deep cold, and then she looked down the hill toward town. She could see from that elevation the thin and struggling smoke from the chimneys of Plover Creek, and she could see, if you knew what to look for, that several of them were not drawing correctly. She looked at this for perhaps 10 seconds. Then she handed me her lamp. "Take Margaret inside. The bed on the left is warmer. It's against the shared wall with the stable. I'll be back before dark." She went down the hill. She visited 4 houses that afternoon. I know this because Jonas told me, and because each of the 4 families later confirmed it independently, in the particular way that people confirm things they are slightly ashamed of not having been able to manage without help. She went to the Hewitt house first, Jonas's family, and found them adequately supplied, but struggling with a chimney that had iced over at the cap. She cleared the cap herself, standing on the roof in that cold, with a long-handled tool she had brought. And when she came down, she told Jonas's mother to bank the fire lower and slower through the night, conserving wood, trusting the structure to hold what warmth the fire produced, rather than burning constantly to replace what the structure was losing. She went to the Brenner family next, and the Aldrich family, and lastly to Reverend Coles, where she found him sitting in his church, which he had opened as a warming space for 3 other families, with the particular exhausted dignity of a man who has been responsible for other people's survival for 19 days, and is nearly at the end of what that costs. She did not say much in any of these visits. She assessed each situation, offered what was immediately practical, and left specific instructions. At the Cole house, she looked at the structure's north wall, frost on the interior surface, which meant the wall was failing to hold the temperature differential. And she showed the Reverend how to hang blankets at a 6-inch distance from the wall, creating the same dead air principle she had built into her own walls, gaining back enough insulation to make the stove's output sufficient. It was not elegant. It was what the materials at hand allowed, and it worked well enough. She was back before dark, as she had said. Margaret's fever broke on the 9th of February. I know the date because I wrote it in the small notebook I had begun keeping, somewhat self-consciously, during my first week in Clara's house. The notebook began as a professional exercise. I had told myself I was documenting her construction methods from an objective standpoint, but by the second week it had become something else. It had become the record of a man understanding, in sequence and in detail, exactly how wrong he had been and exactly why. I recorded temperatures, morning and evening, inside and outside, every day. The inside temperature of Clara's living space never dropped below 54 degrees during the coldest 2 weeks of that winter. On the night of January 29th, which was the single coldest night recorded at the Platte River Station that year, minus 31 degrees, the inside temperature was 58. The stove had burned for 90 minutes that morning. It had not been lit since. I recorded firewood consumption, Clara burned an average of 1/3 of a cord per month through January and February. My own house, before the fuel ran out entirely, had been consuming close to a cord per week and losing the argument with the cold regardless. I recorded the behavior of the animals in the stable, calm, producing well, the cow giving nearly full milk yield even in the hardest weeks, which was not what happened to any of the livestock in town that had not been sheltered properly. I recorded the temperature in the root cellar at the back of the structure, 47 degrees in January. Clara's carrots were firm, her beets were excellent, her stored squash was indistinguishable from what she had put up in September. I recorded these things because they were true, and because I had spent my professional life believing that truth was what I built with. And the notebook was my acknowledgement that I had been looking at truth narrowly and needed to look at it again. The winter released its hold gradually through March. The temperatures rose in increments, the way they had fallen, no single dramatic thaw, just a slow and grudging loosening. By the time most of Plover Creek had accounted for its losses, 3 barns damaged, 1 family's home structurally compromised, livestock deaths across a dozen properties, there was a quality in the town's conversation that I recognized as the specific discomfort of people who have been wrong in a way that cost them something. Dorothy Marsh came to Clara's door in late April. She came alone, which mattered. She brought her finest strawberry preserves, set them on the table, and asked Clara to show her the root cellar, not the living space, not the insulated walls, the root cellar specifically. She had lost half her stored vegetables by February, and she wanted to understand why. Clara showed her. She explained the soil drainage, the depth, the sealed clay walls. Dorothy asked 4 questions, each more specific than the last, and listened to the answers with the concentrated attention of a woman who has decided to actually learn something. She took no notes because she did not need notes. She had the kind of practical memory that women who managed complex households developed out of necessity. She did not apologize in words. What she did instead was ask Clara, at the end of the visit, whether she would be willing to speak at the next Ladies Improvement Society meeting about food storage and cellar construction. Clara said she would be willing. She spoke at 3 meetings in the end. By the 3rd one, Dorothy was taking notes. Reverend Cole came in June. He sat in the chair nearest the stove and was quiet for a while, looking at the room, at the careful construction of it, at the south window, and the angle of the summer light coming through it, at the thickness of the doorframe, and what it implied about the wall behind it. He was a man who had spent 30 years looking at what people built and understanding it as a reflection of what they believed, and I think he was doing that now, recalibrating something. He said, eventually, "I told my congregation to trust in Providence. You built something with your hands that kept more people warm than I managed to." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't think they're in competition, Reverend." He looked at her, and then, "I have this from Jonas, who was present that afternoon." He laughed. Not a polite laugh. A real one, brief and genuine, the laugh of a man who has been handed an answer he did not expect and finds it, despite everything, correct. It was the beginning of something between them that held for the rest of his life. I put down my notebook the day Margaret and I walked back to our own house in the middle of March, the snow retreating but the ground still iron hard underfoot. I had filled 41 pages. I had, by that point, already spoken to Clara about what I intended to do with what was in them. I built my first Voss method structure in the autumn of that year. A small farmhouse for the Aldrich family, sited into a low rise a mile east of town, oriented south, double-walled with cattail fiber, the roof earthen. It was not as good as Clara's. The timber joinery at the northeast corner was not tight enough, and I had to go back in spring and correct it. But the Aldrich family burned 40% less wood that winter than they had the year before, and Mrs. Aldrich told me in February that the house felt, for the first time, like something that was helping her rather than something she was fighting to maintain. I have built 14 structures using these principles in the 30 years since. My apprentices have built more than 30. Jonas Hewitt, who studied with me for 4 years before striking out on his own, has built more than I can count across 3 counties, and his apprentices have built more still. He tells every new apprentice on the first day the same thing. I learned this from a woman named Clara Voss, who learned it from a Lakota elder this town never properly knew. When you build something that lasts, remember where the knowledge came from. Clara Voss died in the spring of 1908. She was 62 years old. She had not left Plover Creek County in the 31 years since she had driven her first stake into the south face of that bluff. And she had not, as far as anyone knew, regretted this. Jonas arranged to have her ledger, all 9 volumes of it, 90 years of recorded temperatures and crop yields and barometric pressures, and careful observations about the behavior of birds and grass and cloud formations, donated to the County Historical Society, where they sit today in an archival box in a back room, largely unread and entirely irreplaceable. The structure she built is still standing. I went out to look at it last autumn, my nephew, which is what put me in mind of this whole account. The earthen roof has been resodded twice in 40 years and looks now exactly as it looked when Clara planted it, seamless, with the hillside, patient, permanent. I put my hand against the south wall in the October afternoon, and the stone beneath the plaster was warm from the low-angle sun, storing what it could against the winter to come. Inside, someone told me, the temperature holds at 55 degrees without any fire at all. It has held at 55 degrees for 40 years. The county assessor looked at it in 1920. In the column where he was required to estimate the structure's remaining useful life, he wrote 2 words, no limit. I think that is right. I think that is probably right. My nephew is quiet across from me now, the morning light coming through the workshop window at the angle it takes in April, falling across the shavings on the floor and the board I was planning when he asked his question. He is looking out the window at the 3 earthen houses on the hillside, which look, in this light, like 3 low hills that happen to have windows, like things that grew there, slow and certain, out of soil and thought, and the refusal to fight the land when you could, if you paid attention, simply ask it what it already knew. Did she know, he asks, how many people learned from her? I think about this. The honest answer is that I do not know what Clara knew, or did not know about her own legacy, because she was not a woman who spoke about herself in those terms. What I know is that she kept her ledger until the last year of her life, recording temperatures in that house, and that the final entries, Jonas showed me once briefly with the care of someone handling something fragile, are written in the same hand as the first ones, clear and even and exact. The hand of a person paying close attention to something they believe is worth paying attention to. She knew Jonas did, I say. I think that was enough for her. She wasn't building a reputation. I pick up the plane. The board is nearly finished. She was building a house.